Hi, Alicia. I'm Leland Vittert. President Trump is set to kick off Independence Day weekend with a trip to Mount Rushmore, the iconic symbol of American freedom carved in stone. Meantime, the acting DHS secretary is talking now about their push to protect statues and monuments.
We're just getting started. We have hundreds of investigations running across the country. Of course, the prosecutions are done by the Department of Justice. The Department of Homeland Security law enforcement officers are involved in many of these. We're going to continue not only to protect the history of this country, but as President Trump has declared, we're going to prosecute violent violators of the law who vandalize property and history of this country or threaten or hurt other Americans.
And Griff Jenkins is live in D.C. with more. Hi, Griff.
Good morning, Alicia. I think this is the first time in history we've had the federal government deploying rapid deployment teams to protect monuments, memorials, and statues on federal property on the 4th of July, along with harsh rhetoric from the president towards those who seek to vandalize them.
Nobody's going to shatter the American dream, not the anarchists, not the agitators, not the fools, not the looters. They're not going to have any impact on the national dream.
This after the president's executive order, which directs DHS under its statutory authority to provide personnel to protect federal property like statues and monuments. These teams will be mostly comprised of Federal Protective Services, as well as ICE, CBP, and the Coast Guard, and sent to hotspots like Portland, Seattle, and the nation's capital, where yesterday a major arrest, remember this? The guy trying to tear down the Jackson statue in Lafayette Park on June 22nd. His name is Jason Charter, identified as the ringleader in that attack, taken into custody by federal authorities and charged with 2 counts of felony destruction of federal property. Meanwhile, the president heading to the Black Hills of South Dakota, where he'll deliver remarks and fireworks will fly high above Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, as will the Blue Angels in a flyover. Some 7,500 folks expected to attend, but he'll be met by protesters. Sioux Tribe leader Harold Frazier, who's calling for the removal of the Mount Rushmore Memorial, is blasting tonight's event, saying, "We are now being forced to witness the lashing of our land with pomp, arrogance, and fire, hoping our sacred lands will survive." And Alicia, as we head into the holiday weekend, several major 4th of July demonstrations are expected in Seattle, Los Angeles, Boston, and right here in D.C. Alicia?
Well, I hope you have a happy 4th, no matter what. Thanks, Griff. Griff Jenkins in D.C.
All right, with that, we bring in Richard Fowler, senior fellow at the New Leaders Council, Fox News contributor, and Brad Blakeman, former deputy assistant to President George W. Bush. Gents, appreciate you being here on a holiday weekend. Richard, to you, there was real unanimous consent among Americans that in the wake of George Floyd's death, things had to change as it related to policing. There was real outrage over what happened to him. But now that everything has become outrageous in the media, from Mount Rushmore to the Lincoln Memorial for some, to the name of Cleveland, to the name of Columbus, Ohio. If everything's outrageous, does it mean that nothing becomes outrageous?
Well, I don't think everything is outrageous. I'm fine with the name Cleveland, the city being named after whoever. I think this is a larger conversation about what we choose to commemorate here in the United States of America as far as these statues go. Now, let's be very clear. These group of individuals, these men that have been glorified in these statues all across the country represent the worst of America. They're not America's dream. They're America's nightmare because they represented some of the most horrific times in this country when slavery was in play, when Jim Crow was in play, when segregation was in play, all things that we can agree are bad. So why are we commemorating
Richard,
these individuals?
I just want to understand, are you talking about statues of Confederate generals, or are you talking about statues of Grant, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln?
I'm talking about statues of Confederate generals, and I'm also talking about statues that depict recently freed African Americans kneeling to President Lincoln. Those are statues that I think represent the worst of America, to be clear.
Brad, as the president is framing this, reframe this debate from police brutality, past Confederate monuments, now to I'm here to defend Mount Rushmore that he's going to today, and I'm here to defend the Lincoln Memorial, and I'm here to defend the Andrew Jackson statue and the like. Is that a better conversation for him politically to be having?
Absolutely. It's a conversation that every American should be having. But the trouble is, Richard talks about a conversation. This is not a conversation. This is anarchy. This is trampling people's rights and freedoms. The 4th of July is about celebrating, not trampling and removing or dictating or intimidating to the American people. If you don't like a statue, there's a way to remove it. Have a petition, have a meeting, have a discussion, as Richard says. You don't take it into your own hands with thuggery and criminality and determine what is right and what is wrong. What did Grant do other than sacrifice his life, his fortune, to free slaves? Same thing, Lincoln gave his life doing it. This has reached a proportion that is unbelievable and unacceptable. That's what the president is saying. We're standing up for the rights and freedoms of all Americans.
Richard, you made the point that we need to have a conversation. Is what we need to have a conversation and what we don't need, or what you'd agree perhaps isn't helpful even to those who want to have these statues come down, is the vandalism and is the, in Brad's words, anarchy that seems to be running amok in some of these cities where you're having statues beheaded and torn down by crowds rather than by our elected leaders?
Nobody wants to see violence in our streets, and I think that's on both sides of the aisle. But let's be very clear. In many of the cities that we're talking about, the government acted. Brave leaders, elected leaders decided to act to take these statues down. Take a city like Alexandria, Virginia, or Richmond, Virginia, or even New Orleans, Louisiana, where all the leaders in this in those communities said these statues represent the worst of America and they must come down. And what we're seeing on the other hand are some leaders that are saying these statues represent American heritage. Well, if they represent American heritage, then they represent the worst of it.
So, Richard,
they represent bigots
where do we
and
draw
racists.
the line, though? Give you the last word. Where do we draw the line? Do we draw it at the statue of Lincoln with kneeling slaves, or that was paid for by freed slaves, or do we draw it at Mount Rushmore, or do we draw it at Columbus, Ohio? Where becomes the line between what you're saying is the worst of America and what parts of America you want to still commemorate?
I think you have to go back in history to figure out where to draw the line. And Abraham Lincoln actually said it himself. In Richmond in 1865, he said the following: "Don't kneel to me. That's not right. You must kneel to the God and thank him for the liberties that you have hereafter enjoyed."
Richard, I understand that you're saying that you don't like the statue that is now in Lincoln Park in D.C. with slaves kneeling. That point you've made. What about the statues to Washington? What about the Jefferson Memorial? What about Mount Rushmore? Those okay to stay?
No, there's no problem with those statues. I think we need to have a conversation in this country about those individuals that were treasons to America and not mix issues. What we've seen over and over again is some of our elected leaders try to mix this and make this about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and it's not. It's about these Confederate statues, many of them that were erected in the 1930s and 40s to bring fear in the hearts of African Americans. Those are the statues that must come down, and that's the conversation that we need to have.
Brad,
unfortunately, that's not the conversation we're having.
That's an interesting point.
That's because of misguided leaders.
So, Brad,
Democratic cities all over America who've surrendered to the lawless. Look what happened to Horace in the lawless area of Portland, Seattle. He was gunned down.
You're mixing apples and oranges here, Brad.
No police to respond, and no help to come in and get him out and save his life. Did you see his father on Hannity crying about his son's slaughter in the streets?
Brad, this is where I'm going to have to stop you, because this is where I will have to stop you, because Horace's death is terrible and we should all mourn that, but that's not what this is about. This is about taking down the hateful statues that have existed in this country that only uplift the worst parts of American history.
Gentlemen, it appears as though whatever conversation we'd tried to begin, we're having some problems with Brad's audio, so we're going to leave it there. Brad, Richard, appreciate it. Thank you very much. President shows up at Mount Rushmore. A few hours from now, we can imagine he might talk about these very issues, either as he heads out to Marine One or there in Mount Rushmore. Alicia?
4th of July celebrations are likely to look a little different this year with coronavirus safety measures in place. Traditional gatherings to watch firework displays just won't be possible. Christina Coleman is live in Los Angeles with more. Hi, Christina.
Hi, Alicia. Well, closed beaches and canceled fireworks shows. It's how many cities are trying to prevent the holiday weekend from resulting in an even bigger surge in COVID-19 cases. 36 states now reporting an increase in the percentage of tests coming back positive for the virus. Texas, Arizona, Florida, and California all hit hard right now and reporting a combined 25,000 new confirmed cases just yesterday. In Florida, Miami-Dade County beaches are closed starting today through July 7th. As South Florida struggles to fight a spike in COVID-19 cases, a midnight curfew is now in place for Miami Beach, and a number of July 4th celebrations have been canceled on beaches throughout the state. And here in California, big rollbacks and loosened restrictions as the state monitors an alarming rise in COVID-19 cases in at least 19 counties. Many indoor businesses, including movie theaters, museums, bars, and family centers, will be closed for at least 3 weeks. And the majority of beaches in Southern California will be closed this holiday weekend, including here in LA County.
You don't want to see you, a bunch of strangers, without being physically distanced and without wearing face coverings over the weekend to the extent you can. That's why we say avoid crowds and avoid going to large parades outside of your household.
Holiday travel also expected to be down this weekend, impacted by COVID-19. And the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut mandating that anyone traveling to the tri-state area from at least 16 states experiencing significant community spread, including California, Texas, and Florida, must quarantine for 14 days. Also this weekend, there's a bigger push for wearing masks. In Texas, the governor issued a statewide mask mandate that went into effect today for counties with 20 or more cases of COVID-19. He also gave county authorities and mayors the ability to ban outdoor gatherings of more than 10 people. This as big family gatherings, barbecues, and parties remain a big concern across the country this holiday weekend. Alicia?
Christina Coleman in Los Angeles. Thanks, Christina.
Is now awaiting transfer to New York. Police arrested Ghislaine Maxwell yesterday at a secluded multi-million-dollar home in New Hampshire. She faces multiple charges, including conspiracy to entice minors to engage in sexual acts. Washington Free Beacon senior investigative reporter Alana Goodman telling Tucker Carlson what friends of Epstein might be thinking this morning.
I think that a lot of the friends of Jeffrey Epstein, who were very relieved after he died, are probably pretty terrified right now at this moment, because I think that Ghislaine Maxwell has every incentive to talk in this situation.
Maxwell is being held right now without bail before extradition to New York.
Global researchers have found a new coronavirus mutation, which they say spreads more easily from person to person. The good news, the mutation does not appear to make patients any sicker than previous forms of the virus. But what could it mean for the search for a vaccine? Dr. Jeanette Nishwat is a family and emergency medicine physician and Fox News medical contributor. Thank you, doctor, so much for joining us today.
Hey,
this was startling news to me. Just curious, how did you take this when you heard that there's this new mutation out there that Americans are now just hearing about?
Well, Alicia, it's not surprising. Actually, believe it or not, mutations are very common. They happen all the time. And what we're seeing with coronavirus is a mutation in one of the spike proteins of this virus, the little legs that stick out of the virus. And so what it's doing is it's making the virus more contagious, more infectious. It multiplies faster in your nose and in your throat and in your sinuses. And the studies show that it's up to 10 times more transmissible. And this could potentially, be one of the reasons why we're seeing such huge outbreaks in the younger population, like in Florida and Texas and Arizona, because it's now up to 10 times more infectious. But at the same time, the disease itself is not more severe. It's not more pathogenic, which is a good thing. But the question remains is this mutation going to affect the vaccine that's under development right now? So far, no. But we'll have to keep following and monitoring to make sure that there isn't any further mutations that might affect the vaccines that are currently under development.
So the vaccine development is not impacted by this, which is interesting. What about testing? And when people are out there getting tests and some of them get false negatives, does this impact that in any way?
Great question. So as of right now, it's not having any major impact on the testing. We have up to 98% sensitivity with some of the current tests that we have. Again, it's just a minor mutation. So it's not having a huge impact in the severity of the disease and in the outcome of the test results, but it's certainly something that we have to continue to monitor and follow. And also, this mutation isn't seen everywhere in the world. For example, the original form of the virus is still in its same format in Iceland and in certain parts of Santa Clara, California. It's still the original virus. So it's not it has not mutated everywhere, but certainly something that scientists are following very closely, because that's one of our biggest concerns is if it changes dramatically where the vaccine will not be effective. But right now it is still the vaccine is still under normal development and looking to still be effective for the current strain that we have.
Do you know, does this change the way the coronavirus task force tries to fight the coronavirus and makes its assessments of what to do next?
Not necessarily. Again, mutations are common. We see it all the time. It's just a matter of following it. And really, this highlights the value of common sense preventative measures, making sure that you continue and are compliant and really attentive to the CDC guidelines of physical distancing, 6 to 10 feet away from other people, wearing a facial cloth covering. And more importantly, especially as we approach 4th of July weekend, you want to do the best you can to avoid large crowds because, again, up to 10 times more transmissible. We don't want you to pick up this virus. It's very easily spread, aerosolized from coughing, talking, sneezing. Wearing a mask certainly helps, but nothing is 100% effective.
And as we do get ready to celebrate our independence here, folks say they have a freedom to choose whether or not to wear a mask. Can you explain to folks how important it is, especially as they're tempted to be a part of these barbecues and celebrations this weekend?
Yeah, absolutely. There's data that shows that if we all wear a mask and protect ourselves and others, we can potentially save 33,000 lives in the next 3 months. So by October. So the mask can really save lives. And, we're not asking you to wear it 24/7, just when you're around other people and you cannot social distance, meaning you cannot keep 6 feet between you and someone else. So when you're at home, you can take it off, you can breathe. This one simple preventative measure can really have a major impact in reducing the transmission of this virus. Because remember, we can't continue to open unless we see a 14-day downward trajectory of the number of cases, the number of deaths, the number of hospitalizations. So we want to get open sooner than later. So if we all can just work together, follow these simple guidelines so that we can resume and reemerge into the community back to our old ways again.
Well, Dr. Nishwat, thank you so much for your advice and your expertise. Hope you have a wonderful 4th of July. Thank you.
Thank you. You too, Alicia. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right now, the new number of coronavirus cases is hitting records across the United States. Trend lines are not going down. We're going to tell you how officials in some hotspot states are taking new steps to protect folks this holiday weekend. Plus, our next guest says the New York Times may have put lives at risk with its report of Russian bounties for killing American troops in Afghanistan. Congressman Jim Banks on his arguments when we come back.
It's no secret the Russians are up to no good. Would I be surprised?
The so-called Gang of 8 yesterday on the New York Times report that Russia offered bounties to militants to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan. The White House says President Trump was never actually briefed on the intel because it was not verified. Our next guest says the Times reporting may endanger our troops there, still in Afghanistan. Republican Congressman Jim Banks of Indiana, veteran of the war in Afghanistan, serves on the House Armed Services Committee, joining us now from here in Washington. All right, Congressman, give us your logic here. How does this endanger U.S. lives?
Well, first of all, Leland, this story is getting really confusing at this point. It was published a week ago in the New York Times, and at that point, the left, in collusion with the New York Times, were attacking President Trump because somehow he was turning a blind eye to these bounties on our troops because he was cozying up to Russia, and Putin started sort of retracting to the old Russian-Trump collusion hoax. Now fast forward, and the left and the New York Times are attacking him instead because he didn't know anything about it. But the fact of the matter is, because a leaker went to the New York Times and they published this ongoing intelligence of these possible bounties, now we might not ever know the truth, and we might not ever be able to hold those accountable for those bounties if the intelligence in case does check out and it was true. That's what I mean. The New York Times, by publishing this story, has the blood on their hands of any lives lost in Afghanistan due to the bounties, because we might not ever know the truth.
So in other words, you're saying,
so
in other words, I just want to understand the logic before we delve in deeper. The logic is that because the Times exposed this intelligence, compromises U.S. abilities and our allies' ability to corroborate the intelligence. Therefore, if the Russian bounties are actually a real thing, it means that there are more troops who are going to be killed, and the Times is responsible because they exposed that the Russians were doing this? I'm confused.
Yeah, and intelligence officers who determined that this intelligence didn't rise to the level of being reputable enough to brief the president on it. And here's what you have to recognize. If this was bad intelligence and they briefed the president on it, the president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, and he took action on bad intelligence, then there would be severe consequences to that. So at the end of the day, we have to allow our intelligence officials to do their job, trust the men and women who serve to protect America every day in the intelligence community. They made this call, not President Trump, not career or not appointed political officers in the administration. Career men and women made this call, and in this case, it appears they made the right call.
People can debate whether or not they made the right call and at what level or not they should brief based on exactly how much certainty they do or do not have. That's a different conversation. But you made a pretty severe accusation against the New York Times when you say they have blood for future U.S. service members who are killed, blood on their hands. It's a serious accusation. I've reported on national security stories before. I've been in discussions with agencies that say if you report this, it has the potential to compromise intelligence. And sometimes we don't report it, and sometimes we do. Those are editorial discussions. I didn't see, though, in the New York Times reporting anything or statements by the administration or others saying what you're accusing, which is that they would have been asked not to report this because of national security reasons. And so those same career folks that you're putting all this confidence in haven't said what you're saying. Why not?
Well, I stand by the claim. The New York Times published a leaked classified intelligence about ongoing investigations into these alleged Russian bounties. And by doing that, they've compromised any further ability to track down further intelligence or to ever get to the bottom of whether or not Russia did put bounties on the heads of our soldiers. I take this story very personally, Leland. I was in Afghanistan serving during the period of time that this intelligence dates back to. That means that those bounties were on my head and the men and women who I served with in Afghanistan at the time. And if Russia was indeed responsible for these bounties, or if it was Iran or anyone else that could have potentially been involved in these bounties, the ability to ever hold them accountable is compromised because of a New York Times story that was based on faulty intelligence.
Well, we know the Iranians certainly have offered bounties in the past. The New York Times is continuing their reporting. Another article out just this week. Congressman, we appreciate your time. We wish you and the family a very happy 4th. Hopefully you get to relax a little bit over the weekend, sir.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All the best. Alicia?
This holiday weekend is unlike any other as Americans celebrate Independence Day during a pandemic. But officials in hotspot states like Texas and Florida are taking new steps to slow the spread after a surge in cases. And Casey Stiegel is live in Dallas with more. Hi, Casey.
Hi, Alicia. Good to see you. Starting today, just about all Texans will be required to wear a face mask in public. Required. You know, up until just recently and today,
deep job hole because Donald Trump has so badly bungled the response to the coronavirus and now has basically given up on responding at all. You know, a million more Americans millions of them would still have their job if Donald Trump had done his job.
Former Vice President Joe Biden slamming President Trump over his response to the coronavirus and blaming him for the nation's struggling economy. Take a look at the jobs reports, which we see 4.8 million new jobs in June. The unemployment rate falling to 11.1%. The program in business and finance at King's College in Manhattan, also a Fox News contributor. Brian, appreciate you taking the time for us. Reasonable people can agree that 11.1% unemployment is Depression era. It's horrific. The question is how to get out of that deep hole. Is it capitalism or is it more government programs?
Well, the way to get out of it is to add 4.8 million jobs a month, and that's what we saw this last month. You know, I think in America right now, there's a level of energy around the economy that we just haven't seen in a long time. There's a big question coming out of this, as we come out of this pandemic, as we come out of the lockdowns, how are people going to respond? Are they going to be ruled by fear, or are they going to be ruled by a desire to get back at it? And what we've seen over the past 2 months, really, in the jobs numbers is undeniable. People want to get back at it. And yeah, the question is, how do we continue that? How do we keep that up? We're not out of the woods, but the fact is the momentum right now is much stronger than anybody predicted. And it's due to one thing. It's giving people the chance to go back to work. There is no way we keep this up. And both President Trump and Joe Biden need to understand this. And I think President Trump certainly does, because he said it. The only way we get back out of this is to keep putting people back to work. We've got a good start in May and June. We've got a lot of work to go.
We know the cruise lines aren't going back to work for a while. It appears as though the airlines are %. Our next guest says American capitalism is under siege and the coronavirus is now taking us back to our roots. With that, we bring in Brian Brenberg.
तुमको ही तो था पाने का मेरा जुनून, तुम जो अब मिली तुमसे ये मैं कैसे कहूँ, पल भर की ये जिंदगी है, कह दे जो कहे, तुझसे ही ये बंदगी है, क्यों अब चुप रहे, तू ही